Hello, my dear masterminds. They assumed you understood their rules because you never challenged them. That's how most systems misread silence. They believe compliance lives in the absence of resistance. They think if someone isn't pushing back, that person must be adapting. So they kept operating the same way. Same expectations, same hierarchies, same unspoken limits. They'd trained everyone else to accept. They spoke to you as if the framework applied. They referenced boundaries as if you recognized them. They acted with the confidence of people who believe the game is shared. What they didn't see was that following rules requires internal agreement. You never gave that. You didn't break their rules loudly. You didn't confront them directly. You simply never internalized the system they were using. You listened without submitting. You moved without aligning. You stayed present without stepping inside their structure. And because you didn't resist, they couldn't tell the difference at first. Resistance confirms the rules exist. You gave them nothing to confirm. You didn't argue their assumptions. You let those assumptions run until they exposed themselves. That's why the realization came slowly, not as a shock, but as a gradual discomfort. Things stopped working the way they expected around you. Their usual influence didn't land. Their incentives didn't pull. Their pressure didn't accelerate anything. You weren't slow. You weren't confused. You were simply not operating from the same reference points. While they were enforcing a structure, you were watching how structures lose influence when someone doesn't recognize their authority. They assumed you were inside the rules because everyone else was. They didn't consider the possibility that you were never there to begin with. Once that discomfort settled in, they started looking for explanations that didn't threaten their framework. They told themselves you were patient, that you were waiting for the right moment, that eventually you'd fall in line the way others always did. Systems depend on that belief. They assume time will do the enforcing if people don't. So they waited, expecting adaptation. What they didn't realize is that time only pressures those who accept the clock they're being measured by. You didn't. You weren't delaying compliance. You weren't preparing a counter move inside their rule set. You were operating without reference to it altogether. That's why time pressure around you felt hollow. That's why expectations lost weight the longer they were repeated. Repetition usually creates authority. Around you, repetition created exposure. Every time they restated a rule, it became clearer. It only existed because others agreed to it. You never did. You acknowledged the structure without granting it legitimacy. That distinction confused them deeply, because most power depends on unexamined consent. You examined it quietly and declined without announcement. They couldn't point to a violation. They couldn't accuse you of rebellion. You weren't breaking anything. You were bypassing it. And bypassing is far more unsettling than resistance. Resistance keeps the system intact by acknowledging it. Bypassing reveals the system as optional. That's when they began to notice how often you moved freely through spaces that constrained everyone else. How outcomes adjusted around you, without escalation. How nothing seemed to bind you the way it bound them. They still didn't name it yet, but the realization was forming. Slowly, inconsistently. And once a realization like that begins, it doesn't stop until it finishes reshaping how everything is interpreted. They started watching you more closely after that, not with suspicion, but with confusion. They expected to see a tell, a sign you were calculating how far you could push before consequences appeared. That moment never came. You didn't test limits, because limits only exist for those who acknowledge them. You didn't probe boundaries because you weren't trying to cross them. You moved as if the boundaries were already irrelevant, and that's what unsettled them. People understand defiance. They understand rebellion. Those are reactions inside the system. You didn't gain freedom by opposing their rules. You gained it by never orienting yourself around them. That's why their authority didn't register with you the way it did with others. You weren't immune. You were uninterested. And uninterested power is the hardest thing to negotiate with. The more they tried to enforce expectations, the clearer it became that enforcement only worked on those who needed permission to begin with. You didn't. You weren't waiting to be allowed. You were already moving. And as they watched this repeat across conversations, across situations, across time, the pattern became undeniable. You weren't selectively following rules. You weren't choosing which ones to obey. You were operating from a different layer entirely. One where rules are observed as behaviors people agree to, not laws of reality. That's when the realization finally locked in. You had never been following their rules. You had been following your own internal logic all along. And once that truth surfaced, there was nothing left for them to enforce. That realization didn't create confrontation. It created recalibration. They stopped issuing expectations the way they used to, not because you pushed back, but because those expectations lost effect the moment they reached you. You didn't absorb them. You didn't reflect them. You didn't reject them either. You let them pass through without attachment, and expectations without attachment lose influence. People rely on reaction to measure authority. When reaction disappears, authority becomes abstract. They felt that gap growing. Conversations became shorter. Instructions became suggestions. Timelines softened around you, not out of generosity, but out of recognition. Recognition that pressure no longer functioned here. You weren't defiant. You weren't compliant. You were unreachable by the mechanism itself. That's when they understood something fundamental. Rules only bind those who organize their identity around approval or consequence. You didn't. You organized yourself around coherence, around internal consistency that didn't need validation from the structure they defended. And when someone operates from coherence, systems don't confront them. Systems adapt around them. That's the quiet ending they didn't expect. No rebellion, no breakdown. Just the slow acceptance that you had never been playing the same game. They thought you were following their rules because that was the only model they understood. It took time for them to see that you weren't above the rules. You were outside them. And once that's seen clearly, it doesn't provoke resistance. It produces silence. And in that silence, the hierarchy subtly shifted. Not on paper, not in titles or declarations, but in behavior. People stopped correcting you. They stopped reminding you how things are supposed to work. They stopped assuming they could steer outcomes by invoking norms you'd never agreed to. The rules didn't disappear. They simply stopped applying in your direction, because rules only function when they're internalized. You never internalized theirs. You acknowledged their existence the way you acknowledge weather. Something that happens around you, not something that defines your movement. That's why nothing dramatic had to occur for the transition to settle. No confrontation, no ultimatum, no moment of open defiance. Just a gradual recognition that enforcement without internal agreement has no traction. They realized that every attempt to bring you back inside their structure required something you didn't offer. Emotional compliance, fear of consequence, desire for approval. You gave them none of it, and without those inputs, the system had nothing to act on. What unsettled them most wasn't that you broke their rules. It was that you never relied on them. You moved freely because your actions were anchored to your own internal order. And internal order doesn't negotiate with external permission. By the time they fully understood that, the dynamic had already stabilized. You weren't resisting their framework. You had made it optional. And once a framework becomes optional, it no longer holds influence the same way. After that point, nothing they tried carried the same weight. The rules were still spoken, still referenced, still enforced on others. But around you, they lost pull. People adjusted without discussing it. They stopped expecting immediate responses. They stopped framing situations as obligations. They treated your presence as something that required a different approach, even if they couldn't explain why. Not respect in the traditional sense. Recognition, the kind that forms when repeated attempts produce no effect. You didn't earn that recognition by asserting yourself. You earned it by remaining consistent when pressure expected movement. Consistency at that level exposes how conditional most authority really is. They saw that rules only function when someone fears stepping outside them. You didn't. Not because you were reckless, but because your decisions weren't sourced from their incentives. You weren't measuring outcomes by approval or consequence. You were measuring coherence. And coherence doesn't accelerate under pressure. It waits. That waiting unsettled them more than open refusal ever could. Refusal gives something to push against. You gave them nothing. So the system adjusted quietly. Expectations shifted. Timelines softened. Enforcement redirected elsewhere. You became a steady reference point. The structure had to work around instead of through. And once a system adapts that way, it does not return to its old assumptions. You were following something deeper. And once that was recognized, the rules lost influence without anyone needing to break them. That recognition settled in fully, and with it came a quiet boundary. No one tried to test again. Not because you signaled consequences, but because they understood there were none. They could apply, that mattered. You weren't calculating how far you could go inside their limits. You weren't testing tolerance. You were operating from a place that never required permission in the first place. Once that became clear, the dynamic concluded without ceremony. People didn't argue. They didn't escalate. They adjusted. They spoke to you differently. They planned differently around you. They stopped assuming compliance and started accounting for independence. And that shift didn't come from dominance. It came from recognition. They saw that rules only hold influence when someone believes in them enough to obey. You never did. You acknowledged their existence without granting them authority over your choices. That's why nothing dramatic happened at the end. No victory, no fallout, just a silent acceptance that you were never following their rules because you were never operating within their system. You weren't above it. You weren't against it. You were simply elsewhere. And once people understand that someone is operating from elsewhere, they stop trying to direct them carefully, precisely, knowing that whatever governs you isn't something they can touch. That's where it concludes, quietly, enduringly. And what does not revert after that is perception. They don't just remember that you weren't following their rules, they stop assuming rules are universal at all. Something shifts in how they interpret authority, compliance, and control. They begin to see how much of what is obeyed is sustained by repetition, belief, and shared agreement, rather than necessity. You didn't lecture them into that awareness. You didn't force it into view. You let them arrive there on their own by never stepping into the frame they were operating inside. That's why it stays. Realizations reached without resistance don't provoke defensiveness. They install themselves quietly from that point forward. People hesitate before invoking rules as leverage. They pause before assuming alignment. They sense, even if they can't articulate it, that some individuals are guided by internal order rather than external permission. And those individuals don't need to be managed. They need to be accounted for. You didn't change the rules. You revealed their limits by not recognizing them as binding. And once that boundary is seen clearly, it doesn't unravel into confusion. It resolves into clarity. That's the settled state, not rebellion, not dominance, but a recalibration of what actually holds influence. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they realized next is that some people never do. What settles last is not admiration or resistance, but orientation. They stop trying to categorize you within their framework, because frameworks only work on what they can contain. You were never containable by their rules, and now they understand why. You weren't exploiting loopholes. You weren't manipulating the system. You weren't selectively obedient. You were anchored to an internal order that didn't negotiate with external permission. That's why nothing about you ever felt reactive. That's why pressure passed you without effect. They finally understood that rules function by shaping behavior through incentive, fear, or belonging. You didn't rely on any of those inputs, so the rules had nothing to attach to. Once that becomes clear, enforcement loses relevance, not loudly, quietly, consistently. People adjust expectations without discussion. They stop assuming timelines apply. They stop expecting compliance as default. They move with more care, knowing there are individuals who operate from coherence rather than constraint. You didn't break their rules. You exposed their dependence on belief. And once belief fades, authority becomes suggestion. That's where it ends. Not with rebellion, not with control, with clarity that holds. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. And in realizing that, they learned something deeper. Some people aren't governed by systems. Systems adapt around them. And this is where it finally settles as something stable. They no longer try to pull you into alignment. They stop testing boundaries. They stop waiting for you to adjust. That expectation fades because they understand now that compliance was never delayed. It was never pending. It was never part of the equation. You weren't learning their system or adapting to it. You were moving according to an internal order that did not require their permission to function. That realization does not spark conflict. It ends it. People stop investing energy where influence does not attach. They stop enforcing what does not register. They stop mistaking structure for authority. And once that happens, the relationship between you and the system stabilizes in a new way. You are no longer treated as someone who needs guidance or correction. You are treated as someone who must be considered carefully, quietly, Precisely, without assumption. You did not dismantle their rules. You made them optional by never recognizing them as binding in the first place. And when something becomes optional, it stops functioning as influence. This is not dominance that needs display, not rebellion that needs noise, but independence so complete it reshapes behavior around it. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is that you never needed to. What remains after this is not tension or unfinished business. It is a quiet correction in how they read reality. They no longer assume compliance when someone is calm. They no longer mistake patience for acceptance. They hesitate before invoking rules, as if those rules are universal truths, because they remember how effortlessly their framework lost relevance around you. You did not oppose it. You did not submit to it. You remained outside it, long enough for its limits to become clear. That experience installs itself. They carry it forward into other rooms, other negotiations, other moments where silence appears. And this time, they pause. They check. They do not rush to assume alignment. You did not leave them with a story about you. You left them with a boundary on their assumptions, a lasting reminder that some people are guided by internal order, not external permission. And when that is the case, rules do not fall into chaos. They resolve into clarity, not a confrontation, not a victory. A recalibration so clean it never needs to be revisited. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is why that realization mattered. And this is where it concludes in the only way it ever could. Not with resistance, not with control, but with recognition that does not need reinforcement. They stop framing you as an exception. They stop trying to interpret you through their lens. They accept, quietly, that you were never meant to fit inside their rules because your movement was never sourced from them. You did not leave their system. You were never formed by it. That understanding settles and stays settled. People do not argue with it because there is nothing to argue against. Your consistency made the reality clear. Your calm made it stable. You did not need to prove independence. You demonstrated it by never asking permission. And once that is seen clearly, behavior adjusts on its own. Expectations fall away. Enforcement redirects. Assumptions dissolve. The system continues functioning, just not in your direction. You remain exactly where you always were, operating from an internal order that does not negotiate with external authority. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is that you never needed to, and that understanding stays with them. It does not require repetition. It does not require explanation. It does not invite debate. It simply remains, quiet, stable, and complete. Hello, my dear mastermind. They whispered. They smirked. They signed the papers like your story was finished. In their eyes, survival wasn't an option for you. You were written off, buried in conversations before you could even speak. But reality has a cruel sense of humor. It doesn't obey their prophecies. You didn't just survive, you flipped their script, and now they choke on silence. Survival isn't just breathing. It's enduring the weight they swore would crush you. It's standing in the fire they thought would erase you and stepping out with scars that gleam like metals. They underestimated your silence. confused it for weakness. But silence wasn't surrender, it was storage. You weren't fading, you were forging. And when you emerged, they didn't see survival, they saw legend forming. Legends aren't born from applause, they're born from disbelief. From the mockery, from the snickers, from the pity dripping in their tones. They said, no way. They said, not them. They said, this will break you. But you turned every word into fuel. Their disbelief didn't weaken you. It transformed you into force. And now, every time your name surfaces, they don't whisper predictions. They whisper confessions. Confessions of how wrong they were. Confessions of how blind they looked. Confessions of how survival isn't about odds, it's about inevitability. You didn't beat the game by chance. You rewrote it. And that's why their silence feels heavier now than their laughter ever did. Doubt is loud, but regret is silent. And silence is the sound that crowns legends. They thought survival was fragile, something lucky, something borrowed. But your survival wasn't luck. It was declaration, a force carved into the fabric of existence that said, this one does not fall, this one does not fold, this one becomes. They didn't believe you'd make it through the storm, and now they live in awe of the fact you became the storm. Every legend begins as a miscalculation. That's what you were to them. A wrong number, a faulty bet, a story that shouldn't have stretched this far. But miscalculations have consequences. They underestimated how long silence can wait, how deep resilience can root. And by the time they noticed, it wasn't survival they were staring at. It was permanence. Their pride told them you were fragile. Their ego told them you were temporary. But instincts don't lie. And every time they look at you now, their instincts scream the truth. You are not fragile. You are not temporary. You are a force made eternal. Survival wasn't your goal. Transformation was, and transformation never asks for belief. It demands recognition. Recognition they can't escape. They may never admit it aloud, but their eyes betray them. The same eyes that once pitied you now hesitate, now scatter, now bow. They don't see a survivor. They see inevitability. Survival ends when the storm clears. But you didn't just wait out the storm. You became the reason storms are feared. They had plans for your ending. They had maps, timetables, predictions. They built their certainty on your collapse. And when collapse never came, they collapsed instead. That's what survival really is. It's not about living. It's about shattering every prophecy written against you. You erased their timeline and replaced it with permanence. And permanence terrifies them. Because it means they weren't just wrong once. They'll be wrong forever. Every time your name is spoken, it proves them fools again. They don't look at you and see survival. They see their own failure to measure you, their own blindness to recognize you, their own arrogance burning. Survival was your answer. Legend is your echo. They wanted you gone, because gone is forgettable. Survival, though, it sticks, it lingers. It carves scars into the memory of everyone who doubted. They thought your silence was the end, but silence was only the pause before the world rewrote you as legend. They can't deny it, they can't erase it, and they can't outlive it. You weren't meant to fade. You were meant to crown. And every crown is born from disbelief. Doubt is the soil, mockery is the rain, Pity is the sun. They gave you all of it, thinking they were burying you. But burying is just planting when the soul refuses to fall. And now you've risen. Not as proof of survival, but as embodiment of inevitability. You're not their survivor, you're their prophecy fulfilled. Every glance you receive now is a contradiction. Their mouths might never say it, but their bodies confess it. Shoulders tense, eyes avert, words stumble. That's not how people look at survivors. That's how people look at forces. You didn't survive like a miracle. You survived like math, undeniable, unshakable, unchanging. That's why your silence is heavier now than their disbelief ever was. They thought your story would end in whispers, but legends don't end. They echo. And you are the echo that stretches across every hall. They thought you'd never walk again. Every room you enter now vibrates with the contradiction. This one was supposed to be gone, yet here they stand, taller, heavier, untouchable. You don't just survive history, you rewrite it. That's why they glance away now, because your very existence is a wound to their certainty. Survival wasn't supposed to look like this. Calm, silent, inevitable. Survival in their heads was supposed to be limping, desperate, broken. But you made it look like ascension. You didn't crawl back, you rose. And rising cracks more pride than falling ever could. They underestimated how legends are built. Not from applause, not from crowns, but from scars that don't bow. You don't wear your survival like an apology. You wear it like armor. And that armor doesn't shine to impress. It shines to remind. Every scar is proof. You can't be bent. They mocked the idea of you lasting. Now they can't last a second in your presence. Presence doesn't ask for approval. It declares. And your survival declared what their words couldn't erase. You are permanence. They thought silence was your weakness. But silence was your edge. Silence collects, sharpens, weighs itself, and when released, it cracks louder than any roar. That's why they fear you now. Not because you lived, but because you live unshakable. Unshakable isn't a title you take. It's a title given when the world throws everything and you're still standing. You didn't choose survival. Survival chose you. And legends are carved from those chosen moments. They can call it chance, they can call it luck, they can call it anything but truth. But the truth doesn't ask for names. It stands, and you are standing. Standing in defiance of every doubt, every smirk, every whisper. Standing not as proof of survival, but as declaration of dominance. They didn't just misjudge you. They misjudged what survival even means. Because when you survive like this, you don't just outlast, you outshine. Their doubt was loud. Your survival is louder. And in that silence after the noise, the truth echoes. You weren't supposed to make it. You weren't supposed to rise. You weren't supposed to exist this strong. Yet here you are, not asking for their belief, not needing their validation, but existing as their living regret. You didn't just survive their disbelief. You turned their disbelief into the legend they'll never escape. They told themselves, you'd fade quietly. That's why their voices sound so fractured when your name surfaces now, because every time they hear it, they're reminded that silence didn't bury you. It built you. You didn't just survive their doubts. You turned those doubts into bricks beneath your throne. And now even their disbelief has become your foundation. A legend isn't created when people believe. A legend is born when they don't. That's why yours cuts deeper than any story they ever heard. They didn't just doubt you, they invested in your end. And when you refused to end, their certainty collapsed. Legends aren't built from easy paths, they're built from shattered predictions. And your survival was the shatter that echoed like thunder. They saw cracks, but those cracks weren't weakness. They were blueprints. Every break they thought they saw was just space for expansion. You didn't collapse under the weight. You expanded beyond it. That's why they stare now, unable to reconcile the image in front of them with the one they wrote off. Survival was the bridge. Legend is the arrival. They wanted closure. They needed your story to end so they could keep believing in their own certainty. But legends don't provide closure. They provide openings. Openings into fear, into awe, into the realization that they aren't in control of the script anymore. You are. Survival isn't the last chapter. It's the beginning of a story they'll never outrun. Their denial is louder now than their doubt ever was. They'll claim luck. They'll claim chance. They'll invent reasons for why you stand. But excuses are the language of the fragile, and no excuse can erase the truth. You didn't just survive. You reshaped survival into permanence. They can deny forever, but denial doesn't stop the echo of your name, because survival doesn't need defense. It needs presence, and your presence is undeniable. That's why they flinch when you walk in, why their laughter dies mid-breath, why even their silence bends heavier around you. Survival isn't fragile anymore. It's become a force, and every moment you breathe in their presence, their illusions weaken. You're not their example of resilience. You're their reminder of limits. Limits they thought didn't exist until you erased them. That's why their posture shrinks, why their words stumble, why their pride fractures. They don't see you as someone who made it. They see you as someone who proved their ceilings were glass, and you walked right through. Legends don't ask for seats at the table. They make the table tremble. That's what your survival did. It turned every space they thought they controlled into your stage. They thought surviving would make you smaller, but surviving made you infinite. And infinite is something even their arrogance can't explain away. They confuse survival with accident, as if you stumbled here by mistake. But legends don't stumble, they ascend, and your ascent wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Every trial they threw at you wasn't designed to crown you, yet it did. Because some souls don't break under pressure, they crystallize, and your name now gleams like stone. They can't scratch. You became proof that survival isn't a finish line, it's a crown. They thought crowns come from noise, from dominance, from fear. But your crown came from silence, from endurance, from inevitability. That's why they don't argue anymore. They just bow in small ways, through their eyes, through their silence, through their hesitation. Instinct doesn't lie. Every legend forces a choice. Believe or collapse. They chose disbelief, and disbelief was the rope that tangled them when you rose higher than they imagined. Now they're left trapped in their own certainty, while you stand untouched. Legends don't need everyone's belief. They just need disbelief to fail, and yours failed spectacularly. Survival was supposed to make you human, fragile, a little cracked, a little tired, a little easier to dismiss. But your survival didn't shrink you, it expanded you. They don't see a wounded figure. They see a force, sharpened by fire, built by silence, wrapped in inevitability. That's why they can't look at you without flinching. Because every glance at you is a reminder that survival isn't weakness, it's power. And power doesn't ask to be noticed, it commands. You didn't just survive, you declared. Every step you take now is heavier than crowns, louder than applause, because survival isn't your story anymore. Survival was just your opening chapter. Now the story is legend. Legends don't fade. They expand, they multiply. They spread through silence like wildfire through paper. And you've become that flame. The light they thought they could smother, but which grew beyond their control. They tried to bury you. Instead, they buried themselves in the proof that they could never erase you. That's why their voices shake when they speak of you. Not because they lack words, but because words fail against permanence. You're not their survivor. You're their monument. And monuments don't beg to be remembered. They demand it by existing. Every scar, every silence, every step you took is now carved into their memory, unshakable. Survival doesn't scare them anymore. What scares them is that survival crowned you, that survival forged you into something untouchable. And untouchable breaks the system they built, the one that thrives on limits, thrives on endings, thrives on collapse. You didn't collapse, you expanded. And expansion isn't something they can control. You've become the edge of their fear, the proof that their rules mean nothing when faced with someone inevitable. That's why your silence terrifies more than noise ever could. Noise can be argued with. Noise can be silenced. But silence? Silence becomes law. And your survival has written its law across every room you walk into. The law is simple. You don't just survive, you transform. They look at you and see their disbelief turned inside out. They see their arrogance folded into ashes. They see a legend forged not in applause but in fire. And every time they try to rewrite your story, the truth shines back through. You were never supposed to stop here. You were supposed to rise. Rising is what terrifies them most. Because rising means they can't keep you contained in the categories they built. Survivor, fighter, outlier, none of it fits. You don't fit categories. You erase them. You've become the presence that doesn't need labels, because labels crumble against you. And the absence of definition is the presence of legend. Legends don't just exist. They haunt. They linger in every silence, echo in every hesitation, live in every glance. That's what your survival became, a haunting. They can't escape it, can't suppress it, can't dilute it. Their entire order of certainty now bends around you, because they don't just see someone alive, they see someone undeniable. And undeniable becomes unforgettable. That's why your name has weight, even in silence. They'll never admit it aloud, but every time they hear it, their posture shifts, their pride cracks, their eyes tremble. They don't see human anymore. They see inevitability walking, and inevitability doesn't beg for recognition, it forces it. They wanted you forgotten. Instead, they made you unforgettable. Because every prophecy that counted you out now stands as proof that you were never counted properly. You're not survivor, you're legend. And legends don't need to fight for memory. Memory itself bends to them. That's why your story isn't about survival anymore. It's about permanence. Permanence without noise. Permanence without spectacle. Permanence written in the silence that weighs on every doubter, every skeptic, every voice that once laughed. Survival is proof. But legend is consequence, and your existence exposes their arrogance daily. That's why they can't look at you directly, because your presence reveals their failure. And failure doesn't fade, it lingers. Every room you walk into reminds them of what they couldn't erase. Every step you take reminds them of what they couldn't diminish. Every breath you breathe reminds them of what they couldn't stop. Survival was their nightmare. But legend? Legend is their eternity. You've become the sentence they'll never escape. And that's the final truth. You didn't just survive. You redefined survival itself. You didn't just escape their disbelief. You turned it into fuel. And now your existence is the law they can't rewrite, the prophecy they can't erase, the truth they can't outlive. No one believed you'd survive, but survival was never your goal. Legend was, and legend is forever.